every American tank that rolled into World War II, in order, from the very first to the very last. And the story doesn't start with the Sherman. Most people know the Sherman. They know it was the M4. But if there's a 4, then somewhere behind it there's a 3, a 2, even a 1. And some of those numbers got skipped. Some got forgotten. And one of them ends up belonging to 2 completely different tanks at the same time. I went through decades of production records and combat reports to rebuild the entire lineup, first to last. Every oddity, every record, every machine almost nobody remembers. And here's the part that stings. You would assume America showed up to this war with a serious tank force. It didn't. It arrived with fewer than 700 light tanks and a design borrowed straight from the French. So, where does it actually begin? With this, the M1917. When America joined the First World War, it had no tank of its own. Therefore, it did the fastest thing it could. It copied one. The M1917 was an American-built version of the French Renault FT, and close to 1,000 were made. But the war ended before they were ready. So not a single one saw combat in the conflict it was built for. They spent the next 20 years as training machines. That's the hole America started from, and it explains everything that came after. By the mid-1930s, the Army wanted something modern, and the answer was the M2 light tank. And here's where it gets strange. The early M2 tanks carried no cannon at all. The main pre-war version, the M2A2, rolled out with 2 separate machine gun turrets sitting side by side. 2 turrets. Crews took one look and nicknamed it Mae West, after the actress for reasons I'll let you work out for yourself. It looked ridiculous, and against a real tank it would have been. But that's not where the M2 story ends. The final version, the M2A4, finally got a proper 37mm gun and a single turret, and it did something this little tank was never meant to do. It went to war. In 1942, M2A4s of the Marines' 1st Tank Battalion landed on Guadalcanal and fought in the Pacific. So, the tank everyone files under training only actually fired shots in anger. Fewer than 700 M2 tanks were ever built, but it became the direct blueprint for the tank that came next. And that tank is the M3 Stuart. This is where the light tank line finally turns into something serious. Take the M2A4, thicken the armor, clean up the design, and you get the Stuart. And America built them by the tens of thousands. More than 25,000 M3s came off the lines between 1940 and 1944, which makes it one of the most produced tanks of the whole war. Why Stuart? Here's the part crews loved, and almost nobody explains. The British named it after Confederate Cavalry General J.E.B. Stuart, the same naming habit that later gave us the Lee and the Grant. The British had a second name for it too. They called it the Honey, because it was reliable, quick, and easy to drive. A sweet little machine. In the Philippines and North Africa, the Stuart is said to have gotten the better of the lighter Japanese armor it ran into, and crews trusted it. It couldn't survive a German heavy, but it was never built to. It soldiered on to the end of the war, and a few kept serving well into the Cold War. But by 1944, the Stuart was already being replaced by a machine that looked almost identical and hid a completely different heart under the hood. That's where we're going next. Quick one before we roll on. If you had to take one early light tank into 1942, the twin-turret Mae West or the Honey, which are you picking? Drop it below. That replacement was the M5 Stuart. And here's what throws almost everyone. Going by the number, you'd expect a more powerful tank than the M3. It wasn't. It carried the exact same 37mm gun. So, why bother? For a reason that has nothing to do with combat and everything to do with airplanes. The M3 used a Continental radial engine, the same kind of engine aircraft factories were desperate for. Therefore, to stop fighting the aircraft plants over engines, the engineers did something clever. They dropped in 2 Cadillac Vate car engines and an automatic hydromatic transmission. Suddenly you had a tank that practically drove itself. Crews loved it. No clutch to master, no grinding gears under fire, just press and go. Nearly 9,000 were built. The Stuart didn't get deadlier. It got easier to keep alive. But while one Stuart was learning to drive itself, another American tank was learning to do something far stranger. It was learning to fly. This is the M22 Locust. And no, that's not a figure of speech. It was literally designed to travel by air. It weighed barely 7.5 tons, light enough to load inside a Hamilcar glider, tow it across the sky, and drop it behind enemy lines so that airborne infantry would suddenly have armor on their side. It's a beautiful idea. It's also a terrifying idea if you're the guy inside the tank, hanging under a glider. America built around 830 of them, and then essentially didn't use them. American airborne doctrine went another way. It was the British who actually took it into battle, dropping it from gliders during Operation Varsity in 1945. So, the one American tank built to fly made its name under someone else's flag. Would you climb into a tank slung under a glider? Be honest below. What the light line really needed wasn't flight. It was a gun that actually did damage. And it finally got one with the last and best of them all, the M24 Chaffee. This is where the American light tank grew up. Out went the old 37mm. In came a proper 75mm, the same caliber the medium Sherman carried. They named it after General Adna Chaffee Jr., the man remembered as the father of America's armored force. And it fits, because the Chaffee was everything light tank doctrine had been reaching for. The problem was timing. It arrived late, in the closing months of 1944, and only saw limited combat in the war. It turned up during the Battle of the Bulge, and not much more. Its real story started after the shooting stopped. The Chaffee lived on for decades, in Korea, and then in armies all over the world, well into the 1970s. Just over 4,000 were built, and they outlasted the war that gave birth to them by a mile. And that closes out the light line. But while America was fine-tuning small tanks, it had a much bigger problem with the big ones. And its first attempts at building a medium tank were honestly a mess. The mess had a name, the M2 medium tank. On paper, it was America's first real medium tank. In practice, it was a monument to an idea that was already dead. In the 1930s, American doctrine believed a tank's main job was to sweep trenches with machine gun fire. Therefore, the engineers did the logical thing inside that wrong idea. They put machine guns everywhere, 8 of them. 830 caliber machine guns spread across the hull, with mounts at all 4 corners so nothing could get close. The 37mm cannon was almost an afterthought. And then, in 1940, the Germans swept through France and proved to the entire world that tank warfare wasn't about that at all. Overnight, the M2 was obsolete. Barely 112 were built, none saw combat, and they spent the war training crews. But it wasn't a total waste, because underneath all those machine guns sat a drivetrain that would become the foundation for what came next. And what came next had an urgent problem to solve. America knew it needed a 75mm gun to fight German panzers. The only trouble, it didn't know how to fit a gun that big into a rotating turret. So it did something desperate. It bolted the 75 into the side of the hull in a sponson mount, where it could barely traverse. That was the M3. And here's where we finally solved that riddle from the start. Because you've already met an M3, the Stuart, the light tank. This M3 is a completely different medium tank, twice the size. Same number, two machines with nothing in common. The Americans called theirs the Lee, after Robert E. Lee. The British asked for a different turret, larger and with a cleaner silhouette, and called their version the Grant, after Ulysses S. Grant. The two opposing generals of the Civil War now bolted onto the same tank design. The Lee was ugly and awkward and far too tall. That towering silhouette made it a target you could hardly miss. But here's the part that matters. When the British took it into North Africa in 1941, they finally had an American tank whose 75mm could actually hit the Panzer's back. Awkward or not, it fired for real. More than 6,000 were built before something better made it obsolete in 1943. And what was that something better? Well, they took that same drivetrain, finally cracked the turret problem, and built the most famous tank America has ever made. That's the one you've been waiting for. And its story is stranger than you think. Here it is, the M4 Sherman, the tank almost everyone can recognize, and the one this whole video is named after. And it all started by solving the exact problem that sank the Lee. Remember that 75mm gun stuck in the side of the hull? Barely able to turn? Engineers finally figured out how to put it where it belonged all along. In a turret that rotated the full way around, 360 degrees. That one change transformed everything. Suddenly, America had a medium tank that was decent, reliable, and this is what really mattered, could be built in numbers the mind can barely hold. Nearly 50,000 of them, 49,234 to be exact. Germany built around 1,300 Tigers. You don't win on quality when the other side has 50 Shermans for every tank you've got. But Sherman is almost a trap word, because there wasn't one Sherman. There was a whole family. And this is where people start getting it wrong. The real difference between them wasn't the gun. It was the engine. The original M4 ran a radial aircraft engine. The M4A1 had the same heart wrapped in a smooth, rounded cast hull instead of welded plates. The M4A2 switched to a twin diesel and went mostly to the Allies through Lend-Lease and to the Marines. The M4A3 got a powerful Ford 5.8 gasoline engine and became the U.S. Army's favorite. The M4A4 was stretched longer to swallow a Chrysler engine made of 5 car engines bolted together. And then there was the rare M4A6, of which barely 75 were made. Same tank on the outside, 5 different hearts inside. And because there were so many, America started turning them into things they were never meant to be. And this is where the Sherman gets truly strange. Take the DD, the duplex drive. Somebody looked at a 30-ton tank and decided it should swim. They wrapped a canvas skirt around it to trap air, fitted a couple of propellers at the back, and launched it out at sea to make its own way to the beach. On calm water, it worked. At Omaha, on D-Day, the sea was anything but calm. The waves came over the skirts, and dozens of these swimming tanks sank straight to the bottom with their crews inside, before they ever touched the sand. The idea meant to save lives cost many. It's the darkest moment in the Sherman story, and it has to be told exactly as it happened. Not every invention was tragic. Some were just magnificent. The Calliope stacked 60 rockets in a frame above the turret and turned the Sherman into a rolling rocket launcher. The Jumbo wrapped itself in extra armor to ram the toughest defenses head-on. And the best of them arrived at the end. The M4A3E8, fondly nicknamed the Easy 8 by American crews, with a new suspension that gave it a smooth, steady ride. That's the polished Sherman, the one that learned from every mistake before it. There's one more version we have to be honest about, because it wasn't American at all. The British took the Sherman and fitted their own enormous 17-pounder gun. They called it the Firefly, and it's said to have been one of the few Shermans that could punch through the frontal armor of Germany's heavies. That was what the British did with it. The credit for that fix is theirs, which leaves the tank's ugliest nickname. German critics, so the story goes, called it the Ronson, after a lighter that lit every time. The British preferred Tommy Cooker. The reputation was for catching fire too easily when hit. The reality is more disputed than the nickname suggests. And midway through the war, America moved the ammunition into water-jacketed bins, a fix that, according to the records, cut the fire risk quite a bit. The Sherman learned from its burns. But however many Shermans you built, there was still something it couldn't do well. To cover that gap, America invented a completely different class of vehicle. What the Sherman couldn't reliably do was fight Germany's heaviest tanks and win. The American solution was odd, and it deserves an honest label. Tank destroyers were, technically, a separate branch of the Army, not tanks in the strict sense. But they were built on tank hulls. They went to battle like tanks, and they are far too iconic to leave out. The idea behind them was almost reckless. Instead of thick armor, they bet on speed. Get close, spring an ambush, fire, and vanish before the enemy could answer. That's why they all shared one telling feature: an open top on the turret. It gave the crew a superb view of the battlefield. It also left them bare to any shell fragment, mortar, or sniper. They lived or died by seeing the threat first. The first was the M10. They took a Sherman's hull, put an angular open turret with a 3-inch gun on top, and built more than 6,000. The Americans never officially gave it a pretty name. It is said the British nickname Wolverine stuck to it long afterward. It was in an M10 that one of the most famous acts of courage of the war took place. The story goes that Audie Murphy, with his own vehicle burning, climbed onto a flaming Wolverine and worked its .50 caliber machine gun against German infantry single-handed. The M10 got the job done, but it was slow for what doctrine had promised. So along came the one that actually kept that promise, the M18 Hellcat. This one was all speed. It could hit 56 miles per hour, about 90 kilometers per hour, which makes it the fastest American armored vehicle of the entire war, a record it still holds. Picture something the size of a tank crossing the field faster than most cars of its day. Its way of killing was pure ambush. Appear, fire, sprint out of sight before anyone could aim back. Hellcat units are said to have destroyed something like 5 German tanks for every Hellcat lost. An impressive figure, though it's worth taking for what it is. A number that gets quoted a lot. Speed or armor, which would you choose to survive? Drop it below. Neither the M10 nor the Hellcat carried enough gun to beat a Panther head-on with confidence. The one that finally did was the M36 Jackson, named, following the habit, after Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Its trump card was a 90mm gun, powerful enough to punch through German heavy armor at real ranges. It arrived in 1944, right when it was needed most, and proved so useful that it kept serving long after the war, into Korea and beyond. And then there's the one that went nowhere. The M6 heavy tank. America designed it as its great heavy tank, 57 tons of steel, and then the Army's own doctrine decided it didn't need it. It never entered combat, not once. Barely 40 were built, and nearly all of them ended up scrapped. A single one survives, in a museum. A great design, killed not by the enemy but by the men on its own side. But that heavy tank idea didn't die entirely. It came back bigger later, and this time at last, with a reason to exist. Before we get to that reason to exist, we have to talk about the tanks that never had one, the orphans. Start with the M7, and be careful here because this number fools a lot of people. The M7 medium tank has nothing to do with the famous M7 Priest, the self-propelled howitzer. Same number, completely different vehicles. This M7 is one of the saddest stories in the whole catalog. It started as a 14-ton light tank. Then they asked for more gun, more armor, more of everything. And it grew and grew, up to 27 tons. At that point, it weighed as much as a Sherman, but it was no better than a Sherman. It had climbed out of the light class without ever earning a place in the medium. Caught between two worlds, standing out in neither. It was canceled. 7 were built. 1 survives, in a depot in Alabama. Even more ghostly is the T-14, a heavily armored assault tank that the Americans and British designed together. 2 or 3 prototypes were built, and then nobody wanted it. No drama, no battle. They simply let it die in an office. Another great effort swallowed by the paperwork. But remember that heavy tank idea I said would come back? Here it is, and this time it did have a reason to exist. The M26 Pershing. For years, American doctrine had resisted building a true heavy tank. The Pershing finally broke that resistance. They named it after General John J. Pershing, and they mounted a 90mm gun, capable of standing up to German heavy armor head-on, something the Sherman could never do comfortably. In March 1945, in the streets of Cologne, a Pershing met a German Panther in the shadow of the great cathedral and destroyed it. And an army camera caught the whole thing, one of the very few filmed tank duels of the entire war. There it was at last, the redemption of the whole journey. But it came late. Only around 310 were made, and very few reached combat before the end. The tank America should have had years earlier turned up just as the war was flickering out. It would truly shine later, in Korea and in armies around the world for decades. And I'll finish with the strangest of them all, the T-28. Almost 95 tons of steel, no turret, a fixed gun, and 8 tracks, built to ram Germany's toughest defenses. It never fired a shot in combat. 2 were made, and here's the perfect detail to close on. One of them was given up for lost for decades, until it turned up, just like that, abandoned and rusting in a field. The monster nobody wanted, literally forgotten until someone stumbled onto it. And that's the pattern nobody tells you. America's best tank of the war showed up when the war was nearly over. But there was one that was everywhere, from the first day to the last, the Sherman. And when I said Sherman was almost a trap word, I wasn't joking. There were so many versions of that single tank, swimming ones, rocket-firing ones, armored ones, upgunned ones, that each one deserves its own story. They're all here, one by one. Go watch.